Hello and welcome to the Massar Podcast, where we explore business and human rights in the MENA region. Together, we demystify the path towards a more rights-respecting and sustainable future for businesses in the Arab world, one conversation at a time. Have you ever questioned what does responsible business across the MENA region really look like? How can companies meet global expectations while navigating local realities? How can companies identify and manage human rights risks and impacts? Masar means path in Arabic, and that's exactly what we're here to explore. The path businesses in the Middle East are taking towards responsibility and sustainability. I'm your host, Krystel Bassil, founder of BHRMENA, and in this podcast, which is brought to you by Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, a rule of law MENA program. In today's Massar episode, we explore how responsible business conduct intersects with labor mobility, social inclusion, and economic transformation across the MENA region. We look at how migration governance, labor market systems, and social protection frameworks shape fair, competitive, and resilient economies. And what does this mean for businesses and their practices in complex supply chains? To help us unpack these issues, I'm joined today by Tanja Dedovic, Senior Regional Thematic Specialist on Labor Mobility and Social Inclusion at the International Organization for Migration, IOM, Regional Office for the Middle East and North Africa. With extensive experience, Tanja is at the forefront of shaping the regional strategies and supporting governments, employers, and social partners to strengthen fairer, safer, and more inclusive labor mobility systems across the Arab region. Tanja, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me and to share a bit of our experience and the work that we do in MENA. Thank you.
Absolutely. So just to start off for our general audience, what is the role that IOM plays in the region? If we just have to introduce very quickly the work that you do, because often when we hear IOM, some of us think crisis response, but the role of IOM is really goes beyond that. Can you tell us how, in what forms IOM is shaping labor migration systems in the Arab world?
Yeah, to keep it really short and snappy, I think two things come to mind. One is that IOM, especially here in this region in MENA, is strongly advocating and working towards operationalizing this whole concept of skills mobility partnerships. And with these type of partnerships, we try to move towards a new model of skills-based labor mobility, which is not just about moving skilled workers from A to B where they are needed, but we promote the investment in skills in A before people will be moved to B. Primarily to ensure that A doesn't remain without the skilled workforce that country A also needs, regardless of the sector, whether it's construction, mechatronics, tourism, hospitality, health. So we want to ensure with skills mobility partnerships that countries of destination that are in need of a certain skilled workforce are collaborating with the sending countries by jointly investing in building, first of all, a skilled workforce before there will be recruitment and mobility. So that's one. And with that, actually together goes ethical recruitment. And that's where we very much pull on the same string together with ILO. So as we move people towards jobs, we want to see that this is done in an ethical manner.
Very clear, and we'll get to the skilling part, I guess, later on, maybe with the whole idea of climate change and just transition as well. We I mean, it's become a stated fact that in the MENA region, many economies heavily rely on large migrant worker populations. And from your current work, where do you see this trend going? Obviously, we still see that many more recruitment is needed, but where do you see this going in the next few years?
Well, since you told me, in preparation for this podcast, that your audience are not just necessarily the multinationals and the large corporate, but actually also the medium and small businesses. And we are fully aware that in MENA, in particular, even in the Gulf, sometimes up to 80% of the economy is made up of MSMEs, not of the multinationals and large corporates. So I think, both investing in a skilled workforce as well as ethical recruitment is as important for SMEs than it is for the multinationals and large corporates. We are in MENA, especially in North Africa, we are faced with the European Union. We are therefore faced with the supply chain directive, which already applies. And in the future, there will be something coming, which is called the EU Green Deal. Now, this Green Deal comes yet with another list of requirements that companies will have to fulfill and adhere to if they wish to engage with the EU and if they wish to export their goods and their services to the EU. So I think building the necessary skills at a broad base will benefit the small and medium-sized enterprises in MENA as much as it will, the multinationals and corporates that are obviously more in the spotlight for ensuring that there is no forced labor in their supply chains. But it will just as much apply for small and medium-sized enterprises if they wish to continue to engage with their counterparts in the EU or in the GCC.
Before we continue on that point, I want to sort of tie in why are we having this conversation and why is it important for businesses to consider this? Because in many of our conversations, many tell us, great, this is like policies and sort of direction of travel that governments are taking. So it's up to the government to decide, for example, where to recruit, how to recruit, and the whole process. So here, exactly, the message is to the SMEs, but also to all the businesses across the spectrum. Why is their role important?
So I would totally not agree with this assumption or with this assessment, because honestly, in the skills mobility partnerships, which we already implement, like in Morocco or in Tunisia or here in Egypt, or we are starting now another one in Lebanon, the trigger for these skills mobility partnerships is not the governments, it's not the ministries of labor, it's the private sector, it's the companies that are in need of a specific skilled workforce. Let me take the example for the skills mobility partnership between Tunisia and Italy. It is the Italian Federation of Construction Industries that expressed their need to the Ministry of Labor in Italy, telling them that the annual quota for foreign workers to bring them in the construction sector is not large enough. It's never large enough. They need like 4,000 workers a year. So now a federation of construction industries is not one big company. In this case, we are talking about a federation that is made up of about 400 small companies. And that's why I'm saying the need to think about where does the skilled workforce come from that you need to employ, and how much are you willing to invest in this building of that skilled workforce is a question as much for small and medium-sized enterprises as it is for large employers like Amazon or IKEA or other, Nestle, Vinci, large construction companies who have huge construction sites. So it's the trigger is the need of the private sector. It's not the governments that usually push for these type of skills mobility partnerships. They provide ultimately the legal framework to make that happen, but the need comes from the private sector. So yeah, that's what I can say from experience.
Very interesting. And looking back at sort of the biggest risks you see with migrant workers, obviously there is many risks that migrant workers come in with their a vulnerable population, but where does the higher risk sits in your experience? Is it at the recruitment? I mean, obviously it's across the spectrum, during or after, but where, if we needed to prioritize our sort of approach generally in the MENA region, where would you advise us to look first? At the recruitment, during, or after?
I think the largest risks are still pre-employment. Yeah? So before someone actually moves for a job, so the pre-departure phase, I think, is really crucial to accompany the migrant worker during this phase, so that the migrant worker has access to information along the whole way, when he is still making up his mind, when he's still trying to decide, as he is signing a work contract, before he departs, that we accompany the migrant worker with as much and as accurate and as updated information as possible. When we do that as IOM, we talk about pre-departure orientation. And we actually usually start even with pre-employment orientation, going into the communities, going into the villages where people are thinking, or where they first time hear about the idea of moving somewhere else for work. And we try to guide them in that thinking and decision-making process. What are your options? What are the alternatives? Is it really migration? Have you looked at other possible options as well? And then, once the person already has a job offer, then we provide pre-departure orientation, which is very targeted information, preparing the migrant worker for that particular job in that particular sector where he is going to move in that particular country. So by the time he arrives there, he already has an idea about the working conditions, the living conditions, and then the other main phase where we try to intervene is post-arrival and during the onboarding phase. So in a skills mobility partnership, we often, for example, try to also work with the diaspora communities in that country of destination. So to go back to that example between Tunisia and Italy, for the onboarding and for the accompaniment of the newcomers from Tunisia, we work with the Tunisian diaspora in Italy that is already there for, some time, works in the same sector, and who can act sort of as buddies for their compatriots who are just arriving. And we do that not least to, obviously, first of all, for the migrant himself, because it is way easier for someone to put their feet on the ground if they have someone that can guide them a bit. And so it's facilitating their social inclusion, their integration, but it's also to address possible secondary migration, right? So if we work with the private sector in a skills mobility partnership to invest in the skills development of the workforce in the country of origin, if we address the private sector to chip in with funding when it comes to the recruitment, I'm just saying employer pays principle, then we also have to ensure that the private sector will benefit from that investment. So we also want to be sure that someone that has been trained, that has been brought on board, will not, after 2 months, turn away and look for alternative jobs elsewhere, which in the case of the EU, they can. So, this onboarding and this accompaniment, ensuring that people don't feel left alone, that they are not overwhelmed with everything that they have to get organized, is also because we want to make sure that the person feels well enough and taken care of and is happy to stay where they are. Yeah.
Just for our audience, very briefly, because obviously we can go into more details, can you tell us what is the employer pays principle?
The employer pays principle is one of the principles of the fair and ethical recruitment established by our colleagues from ILO, and we adhere as much to that principle, which is essentially says that the employer pays, not the migrant worker. And you all know probably that this is not yet necessarily the case throughout, that the migrant does not pay for the job, because very often paying people for a job, for information, for an appointment, for a visa, for an interview, people pay. They pay agents, they pay recruitment agencies, and yeah, that's usually where most of the abuse is happening. And it's the responsibility of the employer to ensure that in their supply chains, using recruitment agencies, and those recruitment agencies, again, using possible subcontractors and agents to reach out to this potential migrant workers, that they do not charge migrants to pay for the job that they are wanting to take on. And it's not just the recruitment fees. It also covers, for example, the fees for training, if that's necessary, in order to be able to take up the job. It's fees related to visa and travel documentation, and of course, the actual transportation costs as well. This should not be paid for by the migrant. It should be paid for by the employer. That's what this principle says.
Very clear. And you just mentioned the recruiters, and I was going to ask you about that. I mean, generally the tendency, especially in sort of the GCC countries, which makes total sense, there is high reliance on recruiters, right? And for mega projects and etc. The employer rarely does direct recruitment from the home countries, and here the recruiters play a big role, I guess, in channeling these ethical practices. As IOM, do you have any approach that's particular to working with recruiters in certain countries?
Yes, IOM is basically, so we have what we call the migration, business and human rights approach. And with this approach, we are basically addressing all of the actors in the recruitment and in the employment. So we have basically training tools and training materials that we use when we train governments, when we train the employers, and when we train recruitment agencies. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, for the migrant workers, we have these information and training orientation sessions to inform them about their rights and about their obligations. So we train basically all the actors, not just the recruiters, not just the employers, not just the government, everyone. Yeah? This is our approach when we talk about migration, business, and human rights. We are using the so-called IRIS standards, which are very, closely linked to the fair and ethical recruitment principles from ILO. And these IRIS standards have been passed on to the Social Accountability Initiative. So they are owning these IRIS standards now. And they are also the ones that can ultimately certify recruitment agencies if they go through the entire training according to these standards. But the training on IRIS standards as such, for governments or employers, we are also doing as IOM.
Thank you for sharing that. So back to climate change and conflict and economic instability in the region. It's obviously reshaping also migration patterns in the Arab world. Can you see particular vulnerabilities that are emerging because of that as well?
Yeah. If you allow, maybe I would like to rephrase a little bit the
Please
question,
do.
because
Please
when
do.
I think about climate change, I would like to also think about opportunities and not only about vulnerabilities. And I tell you why. Um, Typically, when people hear climate change and impact of climate change, everyone thinks about people packing up their stuff and leaving. Yeah. And then, even my own organization, talks about labor mobility as an adaptation strategy.
Mm.
Yes, in that sense, labor mobility can be an adaptation strategy. You go elsewhere to try to continue your life. Yeah. But the opportunity here, and that is what we are working on through our skills mobility partnerships, is that you can also equip people with skills to allow them to adapt to climate change right there where they are. So they do not necessarily have to leave their land and pack up their things and go elsewhere, either temporary or even permanently. So the idea, again, is skills. Equip people with skills that allow them to stay where they are, even if it means that they are, taking a different career path, right? So I give you an example. We are working here in MENA on the development of a training program on controlled environment agriculture, more specifically hydroponic farming. Why? Well, water scarcity is a big topic throughout MENA. Increase of extreme temperatures that don't really allow farmers anymore to grow all year round outside under the sun in the soil. Yeah? So the alternative is to produce inside in controlled environments. Yeah? But that requires more skills. It requires more technical skills because you need to work with agri-technology, localized ideally, but agri-technology. You need to understand how the sensors work, how the irrigation works, how the ventilation works, all of that. By equipping people with these skills, you allow them to change the way how they do agriculture, and they can stay and continue to be farmers, maybe more modern farmers, but they are still farmers. And or with those skills, you can also allow them to move where they are needed. For example, in the GCC, but actually also in the EU. Even in the EU countries, they have huge problems with the, unpredictability of the weather. And they are either suffering, from droughts, or they are suffering from huge rainfalls, which ruin everything. Yeah. So even in the EU, we see that the demand for these type of skills is growing. Hence, the investment in this kind of training and then building skills mobility partnerships around that. So here you have labor migration or labor mobility as an adaptation strategy, but not only in the sense that it allows people to pack up their stuff and go and do something completely different, but if they go as skilled workers where they are needed.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to the very important role of businesses in funding these programs, basically.
Yes.
And investors as well, because
exactly.
At the end of the day, if they're investing in sort of these regenerative agriculture, modern technology, and all of that, they have a role to play in reskilling these workers. And thank you for sharing that example, because it is indeed, when we think of climate change, we think of people, losing their jobs to greener or other types of jobs. But in fact, the key word of our discussion today is skills and reskilling. So
yes.
100%. And I was about to ask you, for the businesses listening to our podcast, if you were to direct them to a certain sort of, there were many local businesses are still very new to these issues, and how would you advise them to, like, what would be the first thing they need to think about when it comes to that. So would you advise them, for example, to consult ILO training programs, or to start by maybe reflecting on the risks and impacts they have in their own supply chain first?
When it comes to skills development, or when it comes to ethical recruitment?
So, and migrant workers in general, depending on where they stand in the supply chain.
So I would say that, you know, especially businesses that are working in the broadest sense on the green transition, which includes actually a lot of different professions. The green transition it starts with renewable energy, energy efficiency. It's about waste management. It's about agriculture. It's about desalination. It's about agrivoltaics. It's so many different new professions actually. So any business that works in these green sectors for the green transition and or the digital transition, I think they would be well advised to, either through their professional associations, if they exist, or through chambers of commerce, or depending what we are talking about, there might even be already federations of industries for these green sectors, to basically produce the evidence, to make their needs for specific skills known, not as an individual company, but to put all of this data together through a survey or through other ways how, you know, a chamber of commerce or a professional association can collect this kind of data and bring it to the attention of the government, to the Ministry of Labor, for example, because this data can do two things. It can make the government think about the educational needs, training programs, and those training programs do not necessarily always have to be like a 3-year apprenticeship program, or a TVET education, or a bachelor study. Those training programs can often be micro-credentials, which are shorter term, like maybe 3 months to maximum 6 months. And the government can start thinking about how to encourage and how to enable, you know, these new training programs to be developed, and so that they can start training people for those skills that are needed by the private sector. And then ultimately the government can also, with those needs that are known for the country of origin, they can also reach out to countries of destination that have similar needs. And that would be the first step and the basis for building a skills mobility partnership. You pair up countries of origin with countries of destination that have a need for a skilled workforce in the same sector, for the same professions. So this is what I would advise businesses, if they are having a hard time to find the kind of skilled workers that they really need, to collect this data in one way or another, aggregate this data, collect more data from the same sector, and bring it to the attention of those that can then take it up at the government level, and look for partners internationally to work on this type of skills development. And you know, when the mobility then basically kicks in, after people have been trained and some people wish to move with those skills, then the ethical recruitment aspect kicks in. And then basically these employers need to be vetted to demonstrate that they are ready to hire, and do that in an ethical manner. And that again can be guaranteed, or it can be assured by including organizations like ILO or IOM, who basically do this vetting process of those private sector employers in the countries of destination. But that's more for the governments to bring us on board than for the businesses. But in order to get to the skilled workforce, that's definitely something that the businesses can do, small, medium, or large, to simply assess what are their skills needs now, but also in the future, like in 5 years from now. Because you have to, in many cases, especially when it comes to the green transition, you will find that you don't have the training programs in place. So you first need time to invest in the development of these training programs. You need to allow for some time for first, second, third cohort to be trained to form that workforce, right?
Thank you so much. I guess that's a very good way of concluding by saying that businesses need to act collectively. And thank you for this conversation, because we really had an overview of what it means to do ethical recruitment, but that also the importance of skilling and reskilling to adapt and react also to the realities of climate change, but also all sorts of other contingencies like economies and needs as well. So I want to thank you very much, Tanja, for sharing your expertise and your experience with us. And thank you for listening to the Massar Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share with your friends and colleagues. And together we can build a better business culture in the Arab world and try to uphold human rights to drive positive change. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.